Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our virtual chat. My name is Gulshan. I'm from America Center Tashkent, and today we're joined by two wonderful speakers. They are virtual American interns at the U.S. Embassy with INL. They will explain later what section it is at the embassy. Thaddian, Burson, and Zacarias Negron. Hi.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having us. Like Ms. Gulshan just said, my name is Zacarias, and this is Thaddian, and we are both interns with the INL section at the U.S. Embassy in Tashkent, which means we work with the Bureau of International Law Enforcement and Narcotics, and we work on all kinds of things related to the justice sector, law enforcement, and judicial reform all around Uzbekistan, and we have been so privileged to get to know your country better and to enjoy Uzbekistan and your culture from afar. With that being said, we are very hopeful today to share with you a little bit about something that is very near and dear to us, which is the art of debate and public speaking. And I think we have a presentation as well that should be coming up in just a moment. But you might be wondering what debate is even of itself. And so we're going to talk a little bit in three different sections about debate in kind of three different ways. I'm going to first talk
Zach, we lost you for a second.
All right, can you all hear me?
Yeah. Yes. Can you repeat your last two sentences, please? Okay.
All right, let's try now. Can you all hear me?
Yes, okay. We can hear you.
Then we will just go like this. So as I was saying, we're going to talk a little bit about something near and dear to Thad and I's heart, which is the art of debate. And we're going to try to do that in around three different ways. I'm going to come up here and quickly talk for you about what debate is, kind of the basics of debate, what that even means and what that generally looks like. And then Thad's going to come and talk about the structure and substance of what actually happens when people debate themselves, kind of the how-to debate in a lot of senses. And then last, we're both going to kind of share a final point talking about public speaking in general and how it is that we should approach public speaking in our lives. With that being said, I'm going to move into what is debate. And I think before we even move into this, I think it's really important to distinguish that we're going to talk about a lot of different things that are specific to debate, but they're also basic and fundamental principles of public speaking and communication writ large that translate to all sorts of different fields, to business, to interviews, to even engaging with professors in school or teachers at your local school in ways that are super helpful in learning how to communicate better. But what is debate? And to understand debate, I think you have to understand around four different concepts. First, the concept of argumentation. Second, structure. Third, refutation. And then last, the nature of debate being pacific or being peaceful. Now, I think these four principles are united by something else. And I'm going to use kind of a big term, and then I'm going to try to explain it. And the term is mechanized disagreement. I think when I was thinking about how to talk about debate, my question was, why is Thad and I's conversation with you today here at the American Center in Tashkent any different from a debate? We're two speakers that are getting up to talk about a topic. Why is this, what Thad and I are about to do for you today, what we're doing right now, why is it not a debate? Because surely we're arguing something, we're talking about debate, and we have some different arguments around it. There should hopefully be some structure. We've tried a little bit to get that structure for you, and maybe a little bit of refutation too. But I think the difference, and hopefully we're going to be peaceful as well. That's the pursuit. But I think the difference is in this concept of mechanized disagreement. What debate inherently does is it takes disagreement between two or more actors through argumentation and mechanizes that disagreement. What it does is it acts upon that disagreement and provides an opportunity for both speakers to begin speaking about that disagreement and speaking with one another about a topic on which they both disagree, if not in whole, at least in some parts of that argument. As such, they're going to employ things like a structure. They're going to have speeches in which they contend with one another, in which they disagree with one another in a way that's structured, in a way that contains arguments, and in a way that we hope remains peaceful all throughout. But these types of debates also take place in a way that's kind of similar to sport. So I want to take you to kind of how debate tends to take place. It takes place in these things called tournaments. And what it's not is what you see right in front of you right now, the kind of image of tournaments that we at least tend to think of a lot in the United States or in the Western world, which is one of knights on horseback and kind of trying to contend with one another to the death. Thankfully, debate does not take place in that kind of arena, but rather debate is the exercise of this sort of structured argumentation in competitions around your country, around your region, and actually around the world. And how this takes place is you have teams of either single or multiple competitors who are representing their schools or a league or a certain group of individuals who have conglomerated together to become a debate team against other debate teams from around the world. These debaters all join together at what are called tournaments. And in a certain number of rounds, sort of similar to how UEFA or how FIFA works, where you move from a round 16 to a quarterfinal, a semifinal, and then a final, you have teams who are debating against one another in a series of rounds on a series of given topics that they're either given beforehand or given right before that round that they then debate on, receive results for, and proceed through the tournament based upon. So teams debate at tournaments very similarly to how football teams, or soccer teams as we call them in the United States, compete at a UEFA or at a FIFA tournament around the rest of the world. This is basically like a way for people who don't play football to speak and play a sport with their words and wearing suits instead of wearing their kits. But what does an actual debate look like? What are we actually talking about or structuring our argumentation over? What is it, in other words, that teams are actually going to disagree upon and mechanize that disagreement from? We think, Thad and I, that we can kind of boil this down to 4 different types of topics. In some different types of debate, we talk about these like motions, or we talk about them as resolutions. And these are 4 different areas that generally topics that you're going to be debating will fall under. And these are policy topics, value topics, fact topics, and this one's a mouthful, but circumstantial topics. I've got here some examples, and I'm just going to read through them with you and discuss really quickly why they fall under each of these categories. So the first one is Uzbekistan should devote 568 trillion som to a new high-speed rail line connecting Tashkent and Astana. Now, we think this is a policy resolution or a policy topic, and there are lots of these that follow that same sort of structure, because what it does is it has a set actor and a set action that is described by the topic itself. So it allows debaters to talk about, in this case, Uzbekistan doing a particular thing, devoting this certain amount of funds for a particular purpose, which means that debaters are then given a particular world almost to inhabit as they're talking about their argumentation, as they're mechanizing their disagreement, and as they're attempting to get towards that goal of winning the round. Value topics are a little bit different. The one we've given you is we believe rehabilitation should be valued over justice. Clearly, very different. We're not talking about a specific actor like Uzbekistan. We're talking about a more ethereal or a more kind of floaty we. And in this case, value topics generally tend to be principled arguments or arguments based in philosophy or in reason, logic, and thought. And what they usually have is some sort of way in which you're supposed to measure one thing and weigh that one thing over another thing. In this case, rehabilitation is to be valued over justice. And the argument then between the 2 teams in the round, whether it's of one person or more, is going to be which is better and how it is that we're supposed to see which is better. You could also be given a fact topic. Fact topics are generally a lot easier to understand and much harder to prove. And that's because it's just what it sounds. It's a fact, and you're supposed to either prove it or disprove it. In the case we've given you, it's that the world decline of the beluga whale species is irreversible. And in this case, you'd have to present a lot of evidence to show us or show the judges in your round that either beluga whales are doing just fine or, unfortunately, they're past the point of no return. And in that case, teams have to argue not that it would be good that that would happen or bad that that would happen, but just whether or not it's happening. And the last one is kind of similar to a combination of all of the above, and you can do a lot with it. And these are called circumstantial topics. They're pretty rare, but they're some of my favorite. And they're where you're put in a specific circumstance, you're given a little bit of information about what's happening around you, and you're asked to make a decision as debaters on either side and tell your judges and your audience why it is that you would choose a certain course of action. The one we've given you is a little bit silly. It says you're the chief of a local village. A raging band of warriors has arrived to conquer you. You have 10 soldiers versus their 40. So you're clearly at a disadvantage. And it says, we choose to fight. In the case of this topic, both teams have to decide how they're going to argue that they're either going to fight or not going to fight. And as such, they have to take in all of the information that they've been given within those few lines and decide which is the most advantageous. In all of these different topics, teams have to do those 4 things that I talked about earlier. They have to engage in mechanizing their disagreement. They can't just simply disagree on these things, but mechanize it through argumentation, through being peaceful, hopefully, in their conversation, through refutation, and through a clear structure. But then I want to talk with you kind of in sum about what the purpose generally is of debate. And we think the purpose of debate is effective communication and articulation. But what does that even mean? That means when you're walking into a class to answer a question that's been given, to ask a question, when you're walking into an interview, to interview for that job or that school that you've always wanted, or when you're talking about an issue that's really critical or really important to you and to your life, we want you to be able to more effectively communicate and more effectively speak on the topics that matter to you, to be able to sum and mechanize the disagreement that you have with those around you in a way that is peaceful and helpful. It's why debate isn't that kind of picture I showed you earlier where there's actual battle happening, because it's a battle with words, one that can be peaceful, one that can be respectful, and one that can ultimately teach you to communicate better and disagree more respectfully. And what it also does is it allows us to have conversations about very difficult topics in a way that can be honoring to one another and in a way that can actually, Thad and I think at least, be incredibly fun. And that's why debate is incredibly popular. Debate circuits exist all around the world, from high school to college, where both Thad and I have competed. So we encourage you to learn more about debate, and hopefully Thad will be able to tell you a little bit more about how to debate when he comes right now.
All right, hello everyone. So I'm going to talk to you for a little while about the structure and substance of debate. Zach introduced you to, in general, what debate is, this sort of mechanized argumentation where we argue about these variety of topics. So now we have to ask ourselves, in light of this, what does a debate round actually look like? Well, the first thing to understand that Zach introduced is the idea of a resolution. Now, this may be called different things across various styles of debate, but a resolution is just the disputed topic that the entire debate is going to focus on. So Zach gave you a couple of examples. Let me give you a couple more. This would be an example of a policy resolution. The US government should forgive federal student loan debt. Now, in a debate round, you have 2 sides, obviously. Sometimes they're called the affirmative and the negative. Sometimes they're called the opposition and the government. Either way, one side is going to be affirming the resolution and the other side is going to be negating it. So an affirmative side in this example would say, yes, the US government should forgive federal student loan debt. And the negative side would say, no, they shouldn't. Another example of a value resolution would be economic stability is more important than economic growth. Again, it's forcing you to debate about which one ought to be valued more. A final example is a fact resolution. The Japanese population decline is past the point of no return. And what these resolutions do is simply focus the debate round. This is where all the debaters are going to spend their time and their research trying to construct arguments to persuade the judge to vote for them. So those are resolutions. But what does a debate round actually look like? Well, debate rounds are typically broken into 3 general parts. You have constructive speeches towards the beginning of the round, rebuttal speeches at the end of the round, and cross-examinations sort of in between the constructive speeches. Now, the purpose of a constructive speech is to present and prove new arguments that support your side. So you can sort of think of it as laying the foundation for your case. Constructives are typically characterized by large amounts of evidence or logic as teams attempt to prove their arguments. Now, evidence in a debate round looks like things like opinions from policy experts, statistics, studies from think tanks and research institutions, all as debaters attempt to make a claim about their specific side of the resolution and support it with external research. So an example of an argument and some evidence that might show up in a constructive speech may look like this. Let's take the example of the resolution about Japan. The resolution is that Japan's population decline is past the point of no return. And let's say I'm on the affirmative side. So I might get up in a constructive speech and say something like this. Japan has maintained a low birth rate, so low, in fact, that over the past several years, it has possessed among the oldest populations on average in the world. Dr. David Smeller, a former US ambassador to Japan, explains that the Japanese birth rate has consistently remained low and continues as such. And if it continues as such, it will bring the Japanese population decline past the point of no return. So in that case, I made a claim that their low birth rate is resulting in the fact that their population decline is past the point of no return. And I presented evidence to support that claim, a testimony from an expert, a former ambassador to Japan. Now, I totally made up that person in that evidence, so that's not a real person. But in a debate round, they would be citing actual people with expert opinions. Now, constructives are in almost every style of debate longer than the rebuttal speeches. So for example, in team policy debate, a constructive speech would be about 8 minutes. Now, rebuttal speeches have a specific purpose, and that purpose is to refute or respond to your opponent's arguments. You can kind of think of it as a time to defend the case that you've built and attack your opponent's case. So it's less about introducing new evidence and new arguments and more about responding. As such, they're less characterized by evidence and more by logical refutation. Now, good refutation is an art that takes years to really master, but typically people give what's called 4-point refutation. And it's just refutation broken down into 4 distinct components. The 4 components are they said, where you're going to state your opponent's argument. I say, you're going to state the thesis of your response because you're going to give the reasoning for your response and therefore. Now, this 4-point refutation is helpful for debate, but it's also helpful across any platform of communication, whether you're giving a speech, responding to a question, or in an interview, where you can help to make sure that first you understand your opponent or your audience's argument, and then you can clearly lay out your response in a logical fashion. So how might this look in a debate round? Well, let's take that argument that I just made about Japan with the example of the constructive speech. A 4-point refutation to that might go something like this. The affirmative claim Japan's population decline is past the point of no return because their birth rate has consistently been unimaginably low. So that's the first component, they said. However, this conclusion doesn't follow. My response is that a reversal of this low birth rate is quite possible. That's the I say, that's the claim that I'm making in response. According to the Brofer Institute, it only takes 5 to 7 years for a country to reverse a negative trend in birth rates. Thus, there is hope for Japan. That's the because. That's the warrant or evidence that I'm giving to support my claim. And then finally, in light of this, Judge, I would urge you to vote for the negative side. That's the therefore, the impact of my response and why it matters. So you're going to see a lot of this kind of 4-point refutation in rebuttal speeches. Now, the last component of debate round is cross-examination. And this happens typically after the first constructives each person gives in a debate round. And this is typically 2 to 3 minutes, depending upon the style of debate that you have, in which individuals get to cross-examine or ask questions of their opponents. The purpose of cross-examination is to expose flaws in your opponent's case. So maybe they cited evidence that's from 1978, but they didn't give the date on the evidence. And you can ask them about that evidence and expose the fact that it's entirely irrelevant in many cases because it's from 1978. So this is generally how a debate round looks. But how does a student or anyone competing in debate actually prepare for it? Well, there's several different components. One of the major components for a variety of styles of debate is research. And while there certainly are limited prep forms of debate, that is where you get the resolution just 20 or 30 minutes before the round, a lot of other debate styles involve significant amounts of research. So this might include reading the news consistently, collecting expert opinions, as we talked about earlier, compiling studies, bringing together research from think tank institutions, all with a focus towards building your case. So for example, if you have that resolution about Japan and you know you're going to debate on the affirmative side at some point in the tournament, you may be researching, looking at think tanks and research institutions to try to find evidence that shows that Japanese population is past the point of no return in terms of their population decline. The other main component of preparation for debate is quite simply practice. Just kind of like any other competitive enterprise, whether that's a sport or an art competition, something that debate needs is practice. You have to do it again and again in order to get good at it. So like Zach talked about, schools or groups of people will form debate clubs where they get together and they may discuss the topics that they're going to be debating about. They may do drills to sort of practice specific skills such as 4-point refutation or cross-examination. And they may do practice rounds. That is where they literally just get up and do an entire practice round for debate. So that's what debate looks like. And that's what practicing and preparing for debate might look like in general. Now, Zach and I want to move into public speaking in general. What are 4 significant tips that apply not only to debate, but also to giving speeches, but also to interviews, to business meetings, and to questions in class? Well, the first thing is confidence. Having confidence, in my mind, is almost 50% of the game when it comes to public speaking, to communicating to anyone. When you're confident, regardless of what you're talking about, it's much more convincing. And building true confidence often takes lots of time and experience. So what you have to do for a lot of what you're going to be doing throughout your life is just acting confident. So what steps can you do to actually enable yourself to more convincingly act confident? One of those is dress for success. Professional attire can actually work miracles. You want to try to get your mind into a mode where it feels confident and can act confident. Second thing is control what can be controlled. It's very stereotypical for students, whether they're in high school or in college, to not eat breakfast, not sleep the night before, and then get up and attempt to perform well. Well, we shouldn't be expecting to perform well if we haven't eaten breakfast and we haven't given our body what it needs in terms of sleep. So control what can be controlled when you go into any public speaking situation, whether it's debate or a speech for your class. You can get enough sleep, eat breakfast, and that'll put you in a better performance mode when you go to give your speech. And then finally, recognize the limited stakes. Public speaking is an intimidating enterprise. So when people get up to give a speech in class or speak in a public debate, sometimes they get extremely overwhelmed about what everyone else is thinking of them. But you have to recognize, quite simply, there are more important things in life than the speech that you're giving at that point in time. And when you recognize the limited stakes and recognize the fact that many of the people in the audience are actually cheering you on and want you to do well, it helps you to control your nerves and present with confidence. The second tip we would give is concision. And concision is simply the idea of being concise in your communication. Public speaking is the challenge of communicating a certain amount of information in a limited amount of time. So let's give an example of this. I could say it's critically important that we remember the necessary nature of the United States' storied and integral relationship with the country of Uzbekistan. Or I could just say that the American-Uzbek relationship is critical. The second example, I communicate the same exact idea in far fewer words and using far less time. And this ensures that in your speeches or in your debate speeches, you can communicate the best and most clear information in the least amount of words. So you can practice concision by summarizing. Many clubs do drills in which they take the amount of content that they're trying to articulate and cut the word count or the time allowed in half. And this enables them and forces the students to try to communicate the same amount of information in half the time. So it's an incredible drill for ensuring that you articulate the best that you can. Another example is having a strong vocabulary. And this is definitely one of Zach's strong suits. But the stronger your vocabulary, the more you will be able to articulate content in more efficient words. So now I'm going to hand it off to Zach for our last 2 public speaking tips.
Awesome. Can everyone hear me? Okay, perfect. Well, while Thad might say that I'm good at vocabulary, what Thad is great at is the ability to make things all start with the same letter. So you'll notice that so far, everything has begun in this section on public speaking with the letter C. So Thad's given you 2 C's. I'm going to give you 2 more C's. And the first C I'm going to give you is already right up there. It's clarity. And in what's almost really similar to what Thad has just given you in concision, clarity is really important for public speaking. I'm going to give you 2 ways, they both start with R in this case, why clarity is critical in public speaking, or how to invest in clarity rather. We think it's through repetition and through risk. Now, I'm going to start with repetition. I think that clarity is often best given when you're speaking, whether it's in an interview or in a debate, when you repeat what it is that you're saying over and over again. Because you need to make sure that the person that you're speaking to actually understands not only what you're saying, but understands the very premise of what you're saying. And then you kind of want to make sure they understand it again. So what you've just heard from me and telling you that right now is that clarity is all about the person who's hearing you understanding you. Again, the person who's hearing you has to understand you if you're going to get your point across. But also, if you're going to win in particular in a debate round, you have to ensure that your judge, who is arbitrating that round, who is the one who decides who wins, you have to understand that they understand what it is that you're actually saying. So repetition can be really critical. I just said it again. But then there's also the issue of risk. Sometimes clarity and ensuring that you provide clarity in a round or in a debate or whatever it may be that you're speaking within requires some level of risk. Sometimes it requires the risk of spending a lot of the time that you're allotted explaining one concept to ensure that someone gets it all the way down. Sometimes it requires the risk of being a little bit annoying by repeating what it is that you've said over and over again just to ensure that someone has understood the point that you want them to understand, just like I have right now again. And it entails the risk sometimes of making things incredibly simple, just like Thad has said within concision, or on the flip side, making things a little bit longer in order to ensure that people actually understand. Again, I've just repeated that many, many times in the effort of clarity. And sometimes we can be a little bit too clear, that's for sure, but clarity should be pursued. But then the last C that I want to give you today is what I think is probably one of the most important C's that we're giving you, and that's the C of compassion. And I'm going to give you two little points underneath this, and these are going to be 1, empathy, and 2, expression. I'm trying to pick up Thad's starting things with the same letter. I think someone asked in the chat already, and we can get more into it when we get into our responses, but someone asked how it is that we can compromise. And I think one of the best ways in public speaking to understand the issue of compromise is through the concept of empathy. It's through the ability to recognize the other person's beliefs, their disagreement with what it is that you are saying, and try to internalize that and understand and view the round from their perspective, or view, even if it's a job interview, view yourself from their perspective for a moment. I want to give you a quick example of this. So I know plov is a huge deal in Uzbekistan. So I want you to imagine for a second that you're engaging in a debate or some sort of conversation where there's some level of mechanized disagreement over which plov is the best. Is it Samarkand plov? Is it Tashkent plov? Which one is the best? Between those two, we're just going to stay between those two. And you could have some that say, well, Samarkand plov is clearly better. It's lighter. Or others could say Tashkent plov because it has this more roasted flavor. Whether or not either of those sides is right, it's really helpful for whoever is arguing for Samarkand or whoever's arguing for Tashkent to think about how the other side would feel if they were told that their plov just wasn't as good, second to the best. And as such, I think that helps you forge a level of compassion within any sort of conversation for the people with whom you are speaking, which is really critical, can not only help you win, but I think actually accesses the main point of debate, which is to speak with one another respectfully and in a way that generates some level of progress. But then the last thing is expression, because empathy is great and all, but if you don't actually express it, and if you don't actually act upon it, it almost means nothing. If I can understand how someone feels and I don't really act upon that and I don't express that I understand that, then in a lot of ways, it's just empathy for my own sake. And so as a result, Thad and I think that it's really important when you're in a debate round to express that sort of empathy through actually engaging on a legitimate level with the other side that you disagree with, but acknowledging what it is that they have right. One of the strongest ways to speak, whether it's in an interview, whether it's in a conversation with friends over plov, or whether it's in a debate, is to acknowledge what the other side has right before you even acknowledge what it is that they have wrong. It's a way of expressing that empathy. It's also a way of arguing in and of itself, and it is a way of exhibiting compassion for the other side in a way that doesn't just view an argument as a zero-sum game where everyone loses unless you win. And so those are sort of our main tips for public speaking and for debate. And we're really grateful that you've joined us today. And we hope that if you're judging us, that you will vote for us. But with that being said, I think we can probably open it up for questions.
Am I muted? Okay. I'm saying that we have a lot of people interested in public speaking here in the America Center Tashkent, and we have some questions coming both from YouTube and Facebook. So Arslan Astanov is asking if it's possible to give a brief explanation on persuasive speech and give some suggestions on how to enhance the level of it.
Yeah, so persuasive speaking is a really important and fantastic sort of category of public speaking. Obviously, persuasive speech, the goal is to persuade your audience. So if I could give you two primary suggestions for persuasive speech, the first would be appeal to external evidence. Unless you're some expert on the topic that you're talking about, which you should know a lot about it, but assuming you're not the world leading expert, you should be quoting the world leading experts in your topic. So whether you're talking about food or culture in another country, or you're persuading them to take a particular action in terms of policy, you want to be looking at what the experts are saying and utilizing them to verify what you're saying. That's going to build your credibility before your audience so that they are more willing to believe what you're saying and be persuaded. The second, and this is really important for persuasive speaking, is you want to give your audience some tangible steps to take in light of your persuasive speech. A lot of persuasive speeches often turn just into informative speeches about a particular topic because the authors and the givers of the speech forget to give the audience tangible steps to take. So they may talk to you, for example, about how McDonald's is absolutely fantastic. But if they're trying to persuade you that McDonald's is better than, for example, Burger King or another fast food restaurant, if they don't give you tangible steps to take in order to follow through on that, the reality is they've just given you an informative speech. So first, appeal to external evidence, do your research to bring in expert opinions, statistics, and studies. But then secondly, give the audience tangible steps to follow through on your persuasive speech.
And I can add to that really quickly in one way. I think Thad has that all absolutely correct. The one thing I would add, and this might sound repetitive, is be repetitive. I think in persuasive speeches, there can be a temptation to have what I call the sneaky persuasive, where you're basically giving an informative speech. You're informing the audience on all of these things that they should know and maybe even that they should potentially do, but you're kind of persuading them in a much more sneaky or in a much more disguised way where at the end you suddenly come forth and you're like, this is why you should believe X thing. And in the process, I think you lose a lot of the time that you're given in the speech to begin working on persuading someone. So what I always argue when it comes to persuasive speech, actually, because Thad taught me this many years ago, is to be as overt and as repetitive as possible, not in an annoying way, but constantly remind the audience what it is that you are trying to convince them of throughout the speech. Sort of pepper into the speech what you're trying to persuade them of at most different turns. When you're transitioning from one point to another in your speech, remind them yet again of what it is that you're persuading them of and be repetitive.
Awesome, thank you. Next question is from Kate Taggart. She would like to know how important it is to find compromise when you have debates.
I can start with this one and then I'll give it to Thad. I think that it's super important to compromise in some sense when it comes to debate. Now, I'll caveat that by saying that the entire purpose of debate is hopefully to show why your side is more right than the other side is right. At the same time, I don't think that it should always be a right versus wrong. I think, like as I was just saying in the compassion point, I think it's really important to understand and to be able to credit the other team where it is that they're right. I think that can be one of the most powerful arguments, is to say, listen, the other side is completely right on this thing, and on this thing. But unfortunately, they're wrong in this, or unfortunately, even if they're right in all of those things, we still win because we've given you this evidence, or because we weigh or we outweigh by saying that our arguments are probably going to be more sustainable in the long run. And so I think in some sense, compromise is very much part of the entirety of the debate. Sometimes you go into a round and you can't run the arguments, you can't speak the arguments that you wanted to going into the round because they're just simply not going to work because the other team has great evidence and seems to be quite right on a lot of things. So sometimes you have to instantly compromise with what it is that you're actually going to say. But when it comes to debate, I think a lot of compromise can come in simply acknowledging that the other side is right while still maintaining a competitive edge.
Yeah, I think Zach nailed that. The trick with debate, and one of the things that it teaches you to do extremely well, is to hold your convictions about a particular topic while cooperating to pursue truth and debate the topics well. And so I think Zach is entirely right. One of the most persuasive things you can do in a debate round is recognizing where the other side actually has it right, but then demonstrating why you should win ultimately in the end.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Our next question is from Furkat Kamkhajaev. He has two questions actually. So first question is, what literature and courses can you recommend to improve public speaking skills? And in your opinion, what are the best ways to improve public speaking? So resources and ways to improve.
That's a great question. So in terms of courses, it might depend on where you are, but taking a public speaking course from your school or your university is always a good start. They're at least going to push you into giving some speeches and practicing writing speeches. And that'll tie into my answer to the second question, because practice, I think, is the more critical thing. In terms of literature, there are tons of online resources with public speaking blogs that are exceptionally helpful. So for example, Ethos Speech and Debate is a great example, or DFW Speech and Debate. They publish articles from champion debaters and public speakers on how to debate and public speak well. So those would be some resources that I could point you to. In answer to your second question, what's the best way to improve public speaking? Hearing about public speaking is great. Going to lectures on it is great. But I think the best way to improve your public speaking is quite simply by doing it. So getting up in front of a class and giving a speech, doing a practice debate round is probably the best way to get better. And sometimes that can seem really intimidating, but that's just you starting on overcoming that intimidation and building your confidence so that at some point you don't just have to act confident, you can actually be confident. One of the ways you can practice that is by just having a friend of yours write a topic on a piece of paper. Maybe it's a quote from a book, or maybe it's a new movie that's coming out, or it's a cultural topic or a political topic. And then they give it to you and you have 2 to 5 minutes to prep a speech, and then you talk about it for a couple of minutes. And that's a great way to just in a more casual way practice your public speaking. But I think the best way is to practice.
Yeah, I can try to attack those questions as well, or answer them rather. I think the first thing that I think of when it comes to literature are all of the resources that Thad has already mentioned. But maybe in another sense, I think that a lot of literature or classic works of literature in and of themselves can sometimes behave as what we would call a polemic, or as a type of debate without a partner that is necessarily within that book in and of itself. And one of my favorites is the work of Plato, when Plato talks about Socrates. So anything like Plato's Trial and the Death of Socrates, or anywhere where Plato is engaging with Socrates, is I think one of the most fundamental works when engaging with the thought of debate. These are all available freely online. He's an ancient Greek philosopher who talks a lot about reason and about logic on how to debate. And actually, one of the main things is to recognize where your opponent might be right, which is something Thad and I have been talking a lot about today. So in some sense, I would recommend that. But beyond that, I think there are a couple of other practical resources other than what Thad has mentioned that I would mention. Most importantly, I would recommend watching your elected officials. Watch your elected officials. Find videos of them on YouTube, wherever they're available. Watch them giving speeches. Watch them in Parliament. Watch them wherever it is that they are giving speeches or interacting through speech. A lot of times, these are individuals that are really good at speaking and that are maybe either going to be engaging in some type of debate or speaking in a way that engages some sort of argumentation. And so not only are you going to learn about public speaking, but in the process, you can also learn a lot about the way that your government works, what needs to be done and what doesn't need to be done. I know in Thad and I's case, one of our favorite hobbies in the past was to watch the goings on of our US Congress, which has debates and conversations and speeches all day long. It can get quite crazy in there at times, but it's something that is quite fascinating and really helpful for someone who wants to learn about public speaking to watch and to learn, particularly because debate tends to revolve around political topics in and of itself. The last resource I would mention are you can find debate rounds online from all sorts of leagues. Thad and I were part of a league called the NCFCA. You can look up Thad and I's names and find all sorts of debates. You can also look up NCFCA and see all kinds of recorded debates where you can see other people debating, which can often be quite helpful. There's also an international league called the WUDC. They're far better debaters than I could ever dream of being. And if you search them up, you'll be able to find really incredible debates on all manner of topics that can also help teach you how to better communicate in that kind of climate and in that kind of setting. And to answer Furqat's second question, I think similarly to Thad, I think the answer is always going to be in more practice. But I think within that, to kind of return to this idea of empathy and compassion, I think the best way to improve is also to recognize that you need to improve. Because I think Thad and I have been public speaking for many, many years now, and I recognize that both of us are still in desperate need of improving our public speaking skills. So until you recognize that you're in need of doing so and that you can learn from others around you or from watching elected officials or whatever it may be, I don't think there is any improvement in sight. So I think that first step beyond just practice is recognizing that we need it in the first place.
Wow, thank you. You mentioned about plov, and we do have debates started here, and people are saying that Samarkand plov is better. My question would be, you're virtual interns. How come you know so well about the difference in Uzbek plov and all the debates?
Sad, do you want me to take that one? Okay. Well, I feel incredibly blessed to have been very interested in Uzbekistan for a long time. So in high school, I was already very interested in Uzbekistan, Uzbek food, Uzbek culture. But beyond that, I live in a little town in Tennessee called Nashville. And in Nashville, we have actually one of the only Uzbek restaurants in my entire region of the United States. And it's one of the best restaurants in our town, I think. And we have all kinds of plov, and they're very proud of their plov. I'm pretty sure their plov is Tashkent's plov, but I might be wrong. But I'm very grateful, and I feel very blessed to know a little bit about Uzbekistan. I wish I was there.
So interesting. All right, should we move to another question? Jack Anderson. Yeah, Jack is joining us. He has a question. When have you found your debate skills particularly useful in your life? How do you keep people from getting mad at you when you argue with them?
I think the question is, when have I not found my debate skills particularly useful in life? Quite literally, debate skills apply to almost every scenario, whether I'm communicating with my siblings or my parents, or going into a job interview, whether I'm sitting in class, because debate doesn't just teach you to communicate effectively, but it also teaches you to think critically and logically. So I can be receiving information from a professor and thinking more critically than the average student would because of the training that we had in debate. So I think in almost any context of communication or thinking, which is pretty much the human life, debate has application. In response to the second question, how do you keep people from getting mad at you when you argue with them? We've talked about this earlier, but first you have to recognize that they probably have some points that are totally correct. You may fundamentally disagree on the conclusion, but the reasoning leading up to the conclusion might be right in some areas. So you have to recognize that they may be right on several points. The second thing, and this is really important for why debate trains us and how debate trains us, is to debate with respect. So we respect the time limits that we have on our own speaking. We only get up and speak for the time limit, and then we sit down and allow them to speak. And so you allow this better form of dialogue that respects the other person's opinion and time to communicate their ideas while allowing you to communicate. So how you keep people from getting mad? Understanding that their point of view may be legitimate on several different reasons. And then secondly, engaging with them in a respectful manner, whether it's in debate or just in a normal conversation, allowing them to give their opinion and responding graciously.
Yeah, I'll start with that question about anger and about getting mad, and then I'll move to the first question. I think that's incredibly right. I think the other way that you do so is like Thad and I have been talking about. You acknowledge where they might be right on things. And so it doesn't just become a question of kind of right versus wrong, but it becomes a question of kind of weighing who's more right or who's more wrong. And as a result, I think you can gain a lot of respect in that interaction. But beyond that, I think the other thing is to recognize that, like we talked about earlier, debate doesn't exist in a vacuum. It takes place at tournaments where competitors are walking in and out of rooms and engaging with one another, just like the teams at a World Cup tournament are going to probably interact with one another behind the scenes, off the field. And in the same way, I think it's really important for your relationship with the people with whom you are debating to extend off of the court in some sense, to extend outside of the room that you're debating in. And that was one thing that Thad and I really tried to prioritize during our time public speaking together, was engaging with the speakers that we were about to go up against or that we just had gone up against outside of the room in a way that was real, substantive, and in a way that I hope was empathetic and honoring to one another. So I think that's one of the other ways that you can generate less anger, because when you recognize that someone actually cares for you, it's much harder to be angry with them. But to that first question, I have to defer to what Thad has already said. The question is really, when has it not been useful to me, or when has it not been helpful? But I'll give two distinct areas where I think it's been most helpful super quickly. I think it's been most helpful within quick response. And I call this sort of the art of translation, in the sense that I think all of us are brilliant. Whoever is watching this, I think you are indelibly, in so many ways, gifted with brilliance. But lots of the time, that brilliance doesn't come out, it doesn't get translated or articulated. Even if you know something that you want to say, oftentimes it gets stuck. Like right now, many of these thoughts that I want to say are kind of stuck. And so as a result, public speaking does this incredible thing of allowing us to quickly translate what it is that we're thinking or what it is that we may know and put it in words and be able to express to others what it is that we might already know or what it is that we would like to know. So I think that's kind of one of the main benefits, is being able to kind of unlock that expression in that translation. But the second thing is really simple, and that's writing. As Thad knows, I tend to write like I speak. And being able to learn how to speak better has helped me learn how to write much more quickly and much more effectively, which I think is really helpful down the line as you enter college and as you enter any sort of career.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to skip questions that have similar questions. Kate is asking, how much time should debates or public speech last so that people won't get bored?
So the answer to that question depends upon the circumstance that you're in. So if people are coming to hear a speaker, a speech could go on for 10, 20, 30 minutes because that's what they've come to hear. But if they're not directly there to hear you speak about whatever topic you're speaking about, maybe you want to temper your time. I think the response more is that it is actually the skill of the speaker to keep the audience engaged for the entire time that they have allotted for their speech. So in normal public debate and speech competitions, a normal speech that's not in a debate would be about 10 minutes. Now in competitive debate, the speech time varies. It can be 5 minutes, it can be 7 minutes, it can be 8 minutes, depending upon the type of debate or speech. But I think the answer is really that your job as the speaker is to keep the audience engaged throughout the time that you're communicating your information. So that means starting off your speech with a compelling hook, a story or an idea that engages the audience, and kind of weaving that through your speech to keep them engaged.
Yeah, and I'll only add very briefly to that I think that one of the critical parts of the art of public speaking, and maybe one that we didn't talk about in our compassion point that we should have talked about, is compassion for your audience. I think you should always be surveying your audience and viewing their facial expressions, what it is that they're showing you without telling you as you're speaking. And being able to see that they are totally done with whatever you're talking about or ready to move on is always a helpful cue to realize, okay, it's probably time to wrap up whatever it is that I'm talking about, because not only am I debating or not only am I speaking to an audience of 2 or maybe 1 on the other side or even just to yourself, but you're talking to all of the people who are out in the crowd or all of the people spectating. And as soon as they are not engaged on whatever topic it is, I think you should try to be respectful to that and try to either move on to a different topic or engage them better. And in the end, just try to respect the audience in a way that can be very compassionate, empathetic, and that can be most conducive to getting work done through your speech.
Mm-hmm. Good. Have you ever participated in the online debates tournaments, or was it always in person?
Yes, we did online and in person.
Mm-hmm. Okay, then probably we'll ask you to organize a small online debate for our audience someday, if you guys have time.
Yeah, definitely.
That would be interesting.
Yes.
Perhaps we could debate about Samarkand versus Tashkent walls.
Exactly. And I think this would be the last question, and to kind of help us summarize and let people know how more enthusiasm in public speaking, can you tell us how to improve your public speaking and how to become more brave when you're speaking?
Yeah, I can start with this one and then I'll pass it off to Thad. I think one of the most important things, just to kind of return back to something I've already said, is to kind of recognize in some sort of humility that you might not be where you want to be. That's something that I think Thad and I have to wake up every single day and remind ourselves of. And so I think that's kind of the first step for improving your public speaking, is kind of this moment of, okay, I want to be better at public speaking. I'm probably not where I want to be right now. So I think that's where you start. But I think beyond that, I think that within that kind of desire and that humility to learn, I think there comes a leveling of the playing field. in the sense that as soon as you start speaking and as soon as you're kind of before others, I think you can quickly begin to conceptualize them, not as kind of anything particularly grand or anyone that is going to have any immense influence on whether or not your speech is good or not, but rather I think you can begin to view those with whom you're speaking or in front of whom you are speaking as peers and as people who are probably just as afraid of public speaking as you are. And as soon as you begin to recognize them as quite similar to yourself, I think public speaking becomes a lot easier, and you can gain a lot of bravery and courage in being able to recognize that there's nothing really that special, nothing very eternal about those people that are surrounding you in your speech or in your debate. And as a result, I think that was really helpful for me in learning to be able to speak before others in a much more congenial and in a much more kind of formal yet casual way, and being able to view them as really similar to myself and really no one to be feared.
I would say 3 things for improving your public speaking, in addition to what we talked about in our presentation. The first is look for opportunities to speak. So maybe your school has a speech and debate club, maybe they don't. Maybe they do a speech class, or maybe you can just volunteer to talk about a topic with a group of people. So I think look for opportunities. The second is practice. I talked about this earlier, but really the primary way that you get better at public speaking is just by doing it. So practice giving speeches to your friends. Maybe it's about a more serious topic like national policy, and maybe it's more about a more lighthearted topic like PLOF. But the reality is just try practice speaking. And then the final suggestion that I would give to you is to watch other good speakers. So like Zach talked about, look up your politicians who are giving speeches. Look up national champions in speech and debate and listen to them give speeches and see how they do it. When I was a lot younger, I used to watch tons and tons of debate rounds, and that helped me substantially when I actually started debate to get better. In terms of how to get more brave when you're public speaking, those 3 suggestions that I just gave are going to be the primary way to build your confidence. The more experience you have, oftentimes the more confidence you have. But this other thing that I would say is fake it till you make it. Oftentimes you just have to act confident. And like I said, we talked about steps to do that by controlling what can be controlled, recognizing the limited stakes, and being ready to act confident in the debate round or the speech round. So faking it till you make it and practicing and getting engaged are probably the best ways to improve your public speaking and build your confidence while you're speaking.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. So I don't think we have any other questions. I want to thank you so much, Thaddian, Zacarias, for spending this evening with us, for your morning, waking up so early just to, present to us and answer our questions. That is very, very kind of you, and we learned a lot. So I really hope we're going to meet someday in person, and we'll ask you to meet our viewers in person here in the American Center Tashkent one day.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.